Hey YouTube, welcome to the presentation Strategies for Weapon Field Recording Success. I'm Aaron Brown, and we recently did a field recording session for some weapons, and I wanted to share some takeaways with thorough documentation to help you achieve success on your future gun recording sessions. The recordists for this session were Chris Carroll, Andrew Corbitt, Dietrich, Jimi Barker, Mac Owens, and Ryan Stunkel, and the shooter was Karl Rehn. So the overview of this presentation is an introduction, pre-planning where we set everything up, the weapon session guide for the day, the Reaper session, all the prep in the DAW, and a summary. And without further ado, safety, safety, safety. Safety first. Guns can be dangerous. Take a gun safety course. You always want to treat weapons as if they're loaded. Never aim them at anyone. Use eye and ear protection, and if you go to a range, they're going to have ear protection. It's very cool. It actually turns down with loud sounds. You can hear people talk, but when it gets over a certain decibel level, it turns it down. It's very cool. If not, you're going to want to bring your own. Make sure it's rated to the proper decibel level for weapons. Don't mess up your hearing. Don't even try to monitor while things are being recorded. Listen back after. Use trained shooters. Safety. Place microphones early. So before the shooter gets there and has the gun and the range is hot, meaning he might be firing and aiming down range, get your microphones out. You want to arrive early, get those mics out, get the placement, get the approximate location. And be stationary while the range is hot, and make sure you only move when the range is declared cold and officially safe. Safety first. So this was the team, all the people I mentioned. It was an awesome day, and Karl, who's just a fantastic shooter, who even slated all the takes. So the intro, it was a one-day recording session not far from Austin, Texas, and we did 6 weapons. We did some handguns, we did a shotgun, and we did 2 rifles. And here's how we planned it out. So before I get into my plans, these are some existing gun recording guides. They're wonderful resources. I'm going to leave a link to this PowerPoint presentation for all of you to click these things. I'll try to leave them all in the YouTube description below as well. But Chuck Russum has a wonderful gun recording guide out there. Thunderbird Sound, which is where this diagram is from, has a really thorough breakdown as well. That I referenced before I put together my diagram, so thank you for sharing that. There's a firearms recording roundtable that's just a must listen if you're going to record guns from the pros, the people that have done more sessions than I'm sure I'll ever record for weapons. And a very cool EA Dice video reference for positions of microphones. So we started with me putting together a big Excel sheet, which I tend to do, with every recorder, the channel description, who owns it, the microphone, the array, what approximate cable length we'll need, notes, whether it's packed or not. So essentially this serves as a checklist for everything you need to bring, including backups. We're talking the recorders, the mics, the blimps, the stands, the sandbags, and the cables. By building a checklist, you're not going to make any mistakes. And it's really important because these sessions can often be expensive or a long drive, and there's no way you can come back home to get anything. So checklists are very important. Use Airtable, Excel sheets. Write it down on a pad and paper. Whatever works for you is what matters. And supplies. Treat this like a remote camping trip. You're going to want a table, water, shade, sunscreen, food, everything that you're going to need to just be self-sustained in the heat or whatever's going on where you're recording. Treat it like camping. And acoustic blankets and blankets. When the shooter's shooting, there will be bullet casings flying out, and if they're lying down or on a knee, you're going to want to make it comfortable, and you don't want any of the elements getting in your mics if you're placing a mic around. So it's best to just lay some blankets down for the shooter. It also gives a good approximate location before the shooter ever arrives on site. And this brings me to backups. You're going to want backups for everything that's important. SD cards, cables, batteries. You don't want to be on session and have something go wrong and not have a backup. So just plan ahead. You know, SD cards are cheap these days, so having an extra one is a very smart idea. So we took a Google Maps snapshot and I outlined it in SimpleMind to make a plan of where the cables are running, approximate lengths for XLRs, as well as making sure we had every important angle covered. And this is a rough outline of how I thought it would go. Interestingly, it's very similar to how it actually went, with the exception of these boundary mics, which did not sound good in front of the shooter. So I used the 4061 boundary mic attachment, and where they are there was super thumpy and terrible. So these got moved behind, but by having an overall plan, most of it went very smooth. People knew where things were going to go. We had the right cable lengths. We had backup cables to account for that. We knew that these metallic structures might be a problem, so we brought acoustic blankets for it. We were ready. So this had a good microphone placement guide for distances based on max SPLs as well. So this 4062 can handle a huge SPL. I think it's 148. The ML2 can handle 166 in dynamic mode. It's the highest max SPL I know of on a microphone. So those can be very close. They can get the mech, they can get the crack, things that other microphones would just clip at the capsule and sound terrible. Those can work. And then these sort of around the area, that's more like 10 to 25, 30 feet. These are more condensers. Some had pads like this MKH 5030. The RSM 191 didn't need it. It's just fantastic with loud sources. Does this nice mid crack, but I'll be playing that later. And then distant drop rigs. So these don't have cables hooked up because these are just set it and forget it. So that was a Sony D100 that ended up over on the right, and an M10 way far away. And I wish we had placed a few more distant rigs, so keep that in mind. Distant rigs are very nice for the tail. So plan your recordist location. Here we ended up clapping around, walking around and clapping as loud as possible, and using the bullhorn to hear the echoes of the location, as well as balancing sounds that we couldn't mitigate. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So we had our cable links, we had our drop rigs, and we had the shelter position for shade because it's Texas and it gets hot. One critical part of pre-planning that we could have done a little better is delegate and define clear roles for the team. We knew some people were running recorders, but we had, as you saw, 6 people, 7 total people, and sometimes we didn't know who was running cables, who was going to place the recorders, whose gear, who's in charge of what gear. And clearly defining that when you have more than 2 people becomes really important so that the session runs super smooth, the loading goes even smoother, and you're not juggling too much. There's a lot going on a weapon shoot day. The easier you can make it, the better. So define who's running the cables, placing the blimps, running the record, who's slating the takes. Make sure that everyone understands those roles as well. You know, each gear has quirks, and you can see in the bottom right here a few of those quirks with each recorder. You know, if somebody doesn't know you need to press pause on a D100 before it actually records, you're just going to get 5 seconds of recording and no actual record. We didn't do that, but it could happen, and I have done it on a trip in the past, and it's always embarrassing when you forget to press pause. But make sure those things are recording. Make sure everyone knows all these quirks and the limitations. For example, one thing I did run into was I just got the MixPre 10.2 and was recording at 192 and didn't read the manual, which clearly states you can only do 8 channels at 192. So we ended up swapping a few channels around to account for that. But it would have been nice to know that beforehand and read that manual. So know the gear specifics. As for a timeline, you can see it took about 3 hours just to prepare. That's not recording weapons. That's just the load-in setup, testing, making sure everything's good to go on the mic end of things and the recorder end of things, and packing out before it gets dark. So we could have arrived earlier, but we only had a few guns, and this was more of a fun test day. So this just gives you an idea of how much time it takes for you to load in and pack out. So add 3 hours of padded time to whatever you want to record, because that's how long it takes. And pre-planning packing. So this is just my gear. This wasn't even Chris's gear or the other people's gear. Make sure you charge all those batteries. And I've got a charging station back there just for this. It's always running. It's always ready to go. And pack and use that checklist. So I brought everything out to a staging area, got the Excel list out, and checked that it's all packed, including all the backups, all the gear, everything. And that is critical. Didn't forget a single thing. And I'm sure I would have, as you can see from this screenshot. It's a lot of gear. It's a lot. So use the checklist, ensure things are good. Double check the settings on your recorder the day before. Just format an SD card. Make sure it's the correct SD card that's approved for your recorders. You know, for example, the MixPre 2 only has, I think, 5 approved SD cards, and some don't work that well and might throw errors. So just look those things up. Make sure you're using the correct things and test it all out. And the day of recording. You can see this is us after we set up some mics. It was very exciting. So executing the plan, we started with the load in, and we had an orientation with Carl, who did a great job, super pro. Get your approximate shooter location. As I said earlier, we walked around clapping and listening. Clap and listen. Find the echoes that are interesting. Find the echoes that might be problematic or resonances that are a problem. Listen for birds and animals and bugs that are problematic. You know, maybe you can't eliminate those bugs and the birds are too loud, so you have to shuffle away from them. You know, the further you get from noises you can't eliminate, the better for the tails. And there are some noises you can mitigate. So, for example, we put an acoustic blanket on that shed to prevent this resonance, and it really helped. We also heard some metallic pings that we got to fix with some gaff tape and other things that we got to mitigate by listening. We put down shooter blankets for the general location, and then we ran all these stands with the microphones, placed about how we thought it should be based on the diagram, and it was very close. Place your recorders and run the cables. I use color-coded XLRs from AudioPile. They're wonderful, and they say what length they are on them, and they get color-coded, so when you plug them in, you know exactly where they're running. I love them. AudioPile, check it out. Chris ran his cables, and they use color tape that was labeled with a marker. So, you know, there's a lot of ways to do it, but clarity becomes critical when you're doing long runs. So just be mindful of the runs and label everything and be thorough, because when things go wrong, it's very important that that is clear. Someone's going to run the drop rigs out, and this is all done before the shooter arrives when the range is cold. It's very important. You know, there's no shooter here right now. This is safe. You make sure it's secure. And we ran out the drop rigs. As I said before, I wish we had a few more, but we did the M10 with the Uzis and the D100 aimed away, and that one sounded great. Double check your recorder settings the day of. And yes, you checked it yesterday, but you better check it today because I don't know what happened, but somehow one of my recorders got set to 44.1. So in some set of things I had plugged in with my Nano Control, or something that happened, or a format, I don't know, things got changed. So double check your recorder settings the day of before you hit record. Don't trust the day before. Don't trust anything unless you see it that very day and hit record. Test all channels. You need to make sure that the stereo is correct, left and right. So have someone snap around the microphone to get the left-right signal for ORTF and MS. You also need to just, scratch. Some people tap the blimp. I don't recommend tapping mics. You can scratch the front to prevent any damage to the capsule if you tap. Some people think that causes damage. I like to be careful with the microphones. But a good just talking into it is probably enough. And document. You can see this pad and paper. Document everything. It's very important that for your own learning and for your later organizing things, you want to document it. So write down what the gun was, the take order, measure distance. Optionally, you can do that with your iPhone, just using the camera app that allows you to measure distance, or bring measuring tape. And write down the channel orders. It's good to slate them as well, so but just writing them down helps solidify it, makes it a lot easier later. So as for shooting, ensure everyone is safe and well out of the line of fire, obviously. And we were well off to the side and behind the shooter, as you can see here. And tell everyone to allow 10-second gaps between each weapon. Generally, people are bad at estimating time, so 10 ends up being 8, and most tails are not 8 seconds. So by saying 10, it seemed to be a good amount of time that wasn't too long for the shooter, made sure everyone was quiet just long enough, felt good. So I'd say a 10-second gap, make sure everyone is aware of it, mention it a few times, because people forget. Recorders, the drop rigs record all the time. So you set them, you hit record, you run back, and they're just running the entire time. They're going to require sync later because there will be clock drift. I'll get into that later. But check the recorder settings on those as well. Make sure people understand how those work. Make sure all recorders are recording all channels and that nothing's routed improperly. And then once everything seems good with the general gain, and if you don't know the gain on the first take, that's okay. The first take, you might just be figuring out gain. I'll go into that later. Then the recorder shouts slate, recording with thumbs up. So once the recorders are running and say slate and give a thumbs up, and they do the physical signal because you're wearing headphones that might be hard to hear things. The documentarian writes the name of the weapon take and the details. Then the person with the slate and the megaphone announces the gun details, maybe does a clap or a clack just for general sync purposes across all the different microphones and all the different rigs. Then the shooter shoots the weapon, waits 10 seconds, continues to shoot until the magazine's empty. And when they're out, says they're done. And the recorders have an optional set of steps here. If it's the first time they've shot, you probably want to listen back. Make sure that your gain structure is correct, that every mic sounds okay, that there are no issues with any of the cables, the signals, really anything. So isolate and listen to each mic real quick. And if there are issues, take the time to fix them. Like I said, pad the time to allow for this to be a part of the workflow, because inevitably something might not sound great, there might be an issue, and you need to just be ready to handle it and take the proper amount of time to fix it. Also, you can stop between each take of each gun and reslate. What that's going to do is make it less clutter for you to edit later, as well as shorter and smaller files. And in 32-bit 192, that adds up. So for clarity, it does help to stop between takes. If you have all your recorders synced, which if you can, do it. If you have multiple mix pre's, you can sync them and they all record at the same time. And I believe they even share the word clock sync, so there's no drift. That's the way to go if possible. And label, in the mix pre, you can label the next take, and everything's named appropriately. So when you import it, it's very clear what everything is. Then the range is cold and the gun is changed, and you rinse and repeat. You do that for all the weapons and, break for lunch, and that's how it goes. As for taking notes, these are some of our notes just for your reference. You can talk about which recorder it is, what the gun is, the name of the take, label takes in recorder if possible. Most of them allow it. Some require an app to do so, or hooking up a keyboard. So try that out. You can link the recorders, like I said, and if you can, that's just going to save a lot of hassle with syncing up later. And now on to 32-bit versus 24-bit. So if you have a 32-bit recorder, particularly the MixPre 2, use the MixPre 2 series. Here is why. So the MixPre 2 is 32-bit that is noise-free and exactly what you want it to be. It's a very long post that I actually already made that I need to remake to be more clear. So that's coming soon. Definitely subscribe. I promise it's coming. But the MixPre 2 series does 32-bit clean, wonderfully, and I'm a huge fan. The Zoom series, however, when you do 32-bit, it injects noise called tearing and noise on the transients as the window switches to handle the different levels. You can kind of think of it like HDR photography. If something's very dark and very bright, you might need to take multiple photos at different light structures. So you can have 3 of the same photo so that one is very dark, one's normal, one's very bright, and then composite them later so that you have all the darks and all the highs and everything in one composited photo. This sort of does that, but with different ADCs. So the MixPre found a way to do it that is smooth, that adds no artifacting, and sounds wonderful pitched down. And you can see that in the top. However, the Zoom, every time it swaps to that other ADC, it injects noise, which you can see here does affect the transient and does inject noise that you cannot get out. It's a part of the recorder process. So 32-bit MixPre 10.2, really any of the 2 series has this solved. I recommend that for weapons. I don't recommend the Zoom because of this. And as far as gain, for 32-bit, your gain structure is only for you monitoring that day. It's really an irrelevant gain structure. It's the same preamp. So whatever you set is just going to be for you listening back during the day. It won't matter at the end of the day. For 24-bit, it really matters. And this is specifically why. It's called the CREST factor, and you can think of it as the peak versus the average level of your recording. So that ratio. You don't really need to understand that, but here's a photo of the wave file to really drive this home. So at the top, you can see a normalized take and how there's no other signal. You just see this very high transient and then almost nothing on the waveform. And that's because the average signal, the meat of the signal, the stuff that's really usable in a gun is 20 to 30 dB quieter from that initial very short transient. And it's very short. Like you can barely see it in this snapshot. So when setting gain with 24-bit, you're going to want to start around 24 dB. Seeing some red, as you see in this photo, is actually just fine. It's preferable in 24-bit. You're only working with 144 dB noise floor in 24-bit. So if, let's say, 30 of that, you're trying not to clip, so you do about 30 dB down, you're now raising the noise floor 30 dB when you gain things up. So inevitably, when you process and bring things up, it's going to be very noisy, which is no good. So in 24-bit, try to start around 24 dB, get red on that initial transient, and then listen back and make sure just the things sound good. And if they sound fine, don't let that red clipping marker throw you off. Remember, it's about 20 to 30 dB CREST difference between the peak and the average signal that you actually want from this session. And troubleshooting. Problems happen. That's just a part of field recording. Just got to deal with it and add time so it doesn't stress you out. There will be plane noises. So if there's a plane, say plane, pause. Make sure the shooter pauses. Make sure everybody waits until the plane's gone. If you can wait for it, it's better than RXing it out. Just always eliminate as much as possible prior to fixing it in post. There were metallic pings. We gaff taped the ones we found ahead of time, but once the wind kicked up during a take, we noticed that there was another ping. So we had to pause, we had to find it, we had to gaff tape it. It was part of a wood fence gate that was very far away, but was audible in the recordings. So keep an ear out, listen between takes, and make sure you're eliminating these noises. Mic and cable issues might happen. We got pretty lucky there because we were thorough, but bring backups and be ready. And there shall be no crying over spilt salsa. So pretty funny. One of the first things that happened, Andrew Corbitt came over and we rode over there together, and he spilled his salsa right away, but he had backup salsa. So that just drives home. Even salsa needs a backup. And stay calm. You planned for this. You allowed for time. You have backups. You're okay. Take the time to really fix it. Don't stress it too bad. Just handle it. And tear down. Once it's all done, shooter's done, everything's cold, no guns pointed anywhere, it's time to tear down. Stop the recorders. The MixPre 10.2 requires a little extra time to do a USB backup, so just account for that. Leave it on. Leave the battery running until it says it's backed up to the USB drive if you're using it. And no gear left behind. You check everything. Use the checklist. And if you packed your bags appropriately, you'll know when things are empty or full. So, the more you use your gear, the more familiar you are with where things go. Put them in the same places and you'll just know. Label your own stuff as well. Like the audio pile for me, it's very clear it's mine because they're color coded and they're very specific. So things like that help. Bags and cases are very important for fast loadout. You saw that in a previous photo. Wrap cables properly and don't waste trips. 2 hands full every trip saves a lot of time. And now for a very quick video demo of the shotgun that we recorded. So this is going to be the shotgun with a mix of all the microphones and then each separate microphone or microphone array. So this is going to be a wonderful reference for you to know where you might want to place your gun microphones in the future.
Remington, 1100, shotgun.
And finally, the Reaper session. This is ingesting the files and preparing the DAW session, which you can see is no small task. So first, ingestion. Copy the files to a folder locally on your drive and back it up to the cloud. Whether it's to your Synology server, Google Drive, whatever you use, Dropbox. Just make sure you back these things up because it's very important material and drives go bad. Transfers go bad, and leave it on the SD card until you know it's backed up. Do your copy. Don't do a cut and paste. Just the more takes you have of it, the better. Redundancy is important. And I organized it by recorder. You can organize it however you want and drag them in, just whatever logically makes sense to you. As for the session prep, I left it at 192 because that was most of our recordings were done at that. Save sessions with names based on the workflow step. I find that better than just saying V1, V2-0004 final. Say things like prepped, aligned, comped, labeled, split. So whatever you're doing logically, add that to the name as you go. Once you're done, you'll see all those stages. And if you made a mistake or you wanted to tweak anything, you can just go back to that stage. And sessions are infinitely small, so just save often as you're working. The drop rigs can be at the very top because they help align all the recordings. That D100 recorded the entire time. And in the top right, you can see here that aligning each individual take to that made it a lot easier. Just gives this clarity to the full day. So if you did stop and start in between recordings, you can align it to that and it generally lines up. Even with drift, the drift between each weapon session, each weapon take is very minimal or not even a problem. And use notes to align all the takes. Hopefully you took the diligent notes I made because there's a lot of material here. You need to know which weapon, if one was problematic, if there were particular noises you might need to RX out, if there were issues, those things help immensely. Then cut out all empty space. Leave a noise gap for RX. Within each take, you're going to want some sort of noise profile. So don't top and tail too tight because you can't noise profile during the tail of a gun. Sometimes you can, but generally you want to make sure you're not getting any signal in your noise profile. So leave that little gap. And it'll look something like this after you do your work. At that point, I recommend you explode your polywaves to multi-mono, and that's done in Reaper with items processing explode multi-channel audio. Now, not doing that before because you're moving things around and you're comping. Doing it after makes it a little easier without having to group things. So I just recommend that order. And at that point, rename those tracks to what was in your notes per channel. And if you had stereo tracks that were either ORTF, XY, or MS, this is the moment where you pan those and you can group them together so that they maintain their phase coherency. So those you're going to lock together timing-wise and pan them left and right. And I always leave every stereo track in stereo. I don't leave it in MS. I don't leave it in anything questionable. I always leave it in stereo. If you leave things sometimes in MS and sometimes in stereo, this stage can be a mess because you might not remember, did I leave that in MS decoded or encoded? And that question is something I never want to ask. So I always leave it all in stereo. And then if someone else messes with it, they don't have to ask. Was that an MS array? And is it in MS or stereo? Leave it in stereo. Now this is a risky adjustment, so this is a warning to anybody. But in Reaper, there's an auto mute on tracks by default in the preferences. So if something is over 18 dB peak, it mutes the track, which is normally awesome because you don't want your ears to, bleed. However, when going in 32-bit, as you saw in the CREST discussion earlier, things can be 18 to 30 dB where the peak is that much over the signal you actually care about. So I recommend turning off that setting for this session, turning it back on when you're all done, and adding some sort of clipper and limiter, true peak limiter, to the master bus. So what that does is it prevents tracks from auto muting just because that initial transient is so ridiculously loud. And then you can get things where the average sounds good, process things, either draw it in with the item to take down that transient, or just add a clipper, add a limiter, whatever you like to do. That's when you do it. So you can clip it you can do whatever you want, but make sure you turn that off so it's not muting your tracks while you're adjusting for that loud transient. And rename tracks. I believe I already said that, so I'll just move on to sync and alignment. Now at this stage, everything's cut. The gaps are done. They're generally aligned, but they're not really aligned. They're loosely aligned. So this is where things actually get aligned. And you can see in this video the general process. Clock sync is real between recorders. So if there's not a shared BNC clock between them, there will be drift. Each clock is running at its own frequency. And over time, especially over a long period of time, you'll notice different amounts of drift, up to say 150 milliseconds. So it's best to adjust the first transient as in that video. You can do this manually by just chopping it, aligning it, and visually dragging things so you look at a part of the waveform that looks similar and aligning them all the way top to bottom. You could also use these wonderful scripts that Aaron Sundon helped, thank you for that he helped put in an REA pack. So you can check that out on his REA pack. And it's AUS Baxter set snap offset and X-Ray Man align. And thank you, X-Ray Man, for putting that together as well, because these two scripts allow you to automate this process by finding the first transient and syncing them all in a line. Saves a ton of time, probably saved me an hour of tedious cutting and chopping and aligning. And finally on alignment, the David Farmer method, which is essentially trimming to the shortest final file. So to account for drift, after you do your first alignment, things still might be drifting out of alignment as they go toward the last transient. So you very well may have to go to the final transient and drag that to sync with the last transient. There is a link here to David's wonderful video all about it. So check that out if you've never done this before. And the real last thing, check phase. You may actually have to flip the phase if you pointed something the opposite direction or you rotated it backwards to face away from the shooter. If you don't, your low end's going to suffer when you combine mics later on. So just look at the polarity of the waveform, listen for any low end loss when you combine things. If you feel like the low end drops or things sound a little off, double check your phasing and realign things. So use your ears and your eyes. Once that's all done, I recommend for organizational purposes to add regions per take with the gun name and add regions per session. So it's the overall day or group of things, and then each different weapon. And color code, because color's awesome and just brings more clarity. Group stereo tracks for clarity as well. Like I said, leave them all stereo LR for no questions asked. And save as a copy, 32-bit trimmed. Once you're all done, this is how you're going to be able to share it with the team. With reduced file size and clarity. You know, no one needs all that dead space. Everybody just wants the source. Keep the session backed up and begin processing in library prep. From here, you know, I don't have these steps documented, but now you've got your raw session. This is where the design fun happens. Now you can solo, isolate, listen to what aspects you want, what you might need later. If you love the mech of a particular gun or you like the Neumann perspective, this is what you'll reference later when you're designing your weapons. And finally, a summary. Safety first. Remember, these are weapons. They can be very dangerous, so safety first. Make sure that shooter range is cold and there's no guns aimed or live before you move around. And take a gun safety course. It's worth it. Build a clear plan with roles assigned. Everyone needs to know what they're going to do that day and how each particular piece of gear works for them. Prep your gear and supplies ahead of time, charge it, get it ready, stage it, and make that Excel sheet. And arrive early. You've got that 3-hour buffer I mentioned just for tear down and setup. So planning for that accordingly is important. Find the balanced shooter position between the noise that you can mitigate and can't, as well as clapping to find the good echoes and positioning. As far as general positioning for microphones, the high SPL can be within 0 to 10 feet based on our session. These are loose rules because, everyone's got their own opinions on this. This was just what we found. If you have other things, please leave them below. But high SPL 0 to 10 feet seemed fine, particularly the 4062 and the ML2 in dynamic mode because those are rated, I believe, 148 and 166 SPL. And then normal SPL mics that aren't dynamics, more condenser mics, could be, say, 10 to 30 feet and sound fantastic. Some may need a pad. You'll learn when you listen back if they actually need a pad. And sensitive SPL, say the UCIs that often clip on even medium loud sources, sound fantastic very far away. So, the D100 at a gain of about, I think it was 4, or the UCIs very far away through an M10 were just fine. In fact, I know other people that have used them very far away and found it to be their favorite tail sound of the session. So, getting sensitive SPL very far away is actually worth it because now you're picking up the tail more sensitive than anything that would just be too insensitive for the tail. And double check all mics and recorder settings before recording. The Mix Pre 2 is the winner for 32-bit. It's clean. The Zoom injects that noise problem, but the Mix Pre 2 is fantastic, clean, and I love it. So if anybody's thinking of 32-bit, Mix Pre 2 is the winner. Listen between takes and adjust accordingly. You can't hear when they're shooting. You have to, pause it, take a listen back, play back the tracks, diagnose if there's any issues, and then continue. Take thorough notes and align all session transients for clarity later on. And that is the presentation. So go forth and record your own sounds. I hope you found this very useful. And thank you for coming to my channel. Please leave any comments with any questions. And I hope you have a good gun session soon.